December 7th, 1941. Sunday morning in paradise. The sun rose over Oahu at 6:43 a.m., painting the mountains gold behind Pearl Harbor. 7 battleships of the United States Pacific Fleet rested along Ford Island in neat pairs, their crews sleeping off Saturday night's shore leave. The 8th USS Pennsylvania sat in dry dock nearby. The USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma, the USS California, each displacing over 35,000 tons of American steel, symbols of power that had kept the peace across the Pacific for 2 decades. 350 miles to the north, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers had already turned into the wind. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had spent nearly a year refining the plan for this attack. He knew America's industrial strength, had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood what this attack would unleash. But Japan's empire was choking. American oil embargoes were strangling the war machine that had conquered Manchuria and carved deep into China. The military leadership in Tokyo saw only one path forward: destroy America's Pacific Fleet before it could mobilize, buy time to secure the resources of Southeast Asia, present Washington with a fait accompli too costly to reverse. At 6 a.m., the first wave launched. 49 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, 40 high-level bombers, and 43 fighters. They climbed through the dawn, formed up, and set course for Oahu. Is less than Hashone, 0 hash is greater than 7:48 a.m. The first explosions struck Wheeler Field and Battleship Row almost simultaneously. 3 minutes later, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida radioed back to the fleet. Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The code for complete surprise achieved. Then the harbour erupted. Torpedo bombers skimmed across the water at 60 feet, threading between ships, releasing their weapons into Battleship Row. The Oklahoma took as many as 9 torpedoes within minutes and began to roll. Men scrambled across her hull as she capsized. 432 sailors trapped inside as she settled upside down in the mud. The West Virginia absorbed 7 torpedoes, but her crew counter-flooded, keeping her upright against the moorings. The California, the Nevada, the Tennessee, each taking hit after hit. At 8:10 a.m., a high-level bomber placed an 1,800-pound armor-piercing shell, a modified battleship projectile, directly through the Arizona's forward magazine. The explosion lifted the over 35,000-ton ship out of the water. The forward magazines detonated in a fireball that rose 500 feet into the morning sky. She sank in 9 minutes. 1,177 men died with her, nearly half of all Americans killed that morning. By 10 a.m., it was over. 5 battleships rested on the harbour bottom. 3 more heavily damaged. 188 American aircraft destroyed on the ground. 2,403 Americans dead. Japan lost 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and 64 men. But 3 aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, the Lexington, the Saratoga, were at sea that morning, delivering aircraft to Midway and Wake Island. Yamamoto's primary targets had escaped. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress and called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Within an hour, America declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Hitler declared war on America. The Second World War had become truly global. But this attack, intended to cripple America, had made a fatal miscalculation. The battleships Japan destroyed were already obsolete. The carriers that escaped would revolutionize naval warfare. And Japan had awakened something it could never defeat: American industrial might, coupled with absolute resolve. The road to Pearl Harbor began not in 1941, but a decade earlier in the frozen fields of Manchuria. September 18th, 1931. Japanese officers of the Kwantung Army staged an explosion on the South Manchurian Railway near Mukden, blamed Chinese dissidents, and used it as justification to occupy the entire region. The League of Nations condemned the action. Japan withdrew from the League in March 1933 and kept Manchuria. It was the first step in what Tokyo called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a euphemism for empire. By 1937, Japan had launched a full-scale invasion of China. The capture of Nanking that December became notorious for atrocities that shocked the world. The murder of an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war. But China refused to surrender, retreating inland to Chongqing, and the war became a grinding stalemate that consumed Japanese resources at an alarming rate. Japan's problem was fundamental. The empire possessed almost no natural resources. No oil, no rubber, no tin, tungsten, or bauxite. Roughly 80% of Japan's oil and nearly 90% of its scrap iron came from the United States. The empire's industrial war machine ran on American fuel. The solution, Tokyo's military leadership concluded, lay to the south. French Indochina held rice and rubber. The Dutch East Indies possessed one of the world's richest oil fields. British Malaya offered tin. The Philippines controlled strategic sea lanes. In September 1940, Japan forced Vichy France to allow troops into northern Indochina. That same month, Tokyo signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, formally joining the Axis powers. President Franklin Roosevelt watched these moves with growing alarm. He responded with economic pressure. In July 1940, Roosevelt signed the Export Control Act, restricting sales of aviation fuel and scrap metal to Japan. In September, he extended the embargo to all scrap iron and steel. Then he moved the fleet. In the spring of 1940, at Roosevelt's direction, the Pacific Fleet was ordered to move from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Admiral James Richardson opposed the move strenuously. Pearl Harbor lacked adequate facilities, and the fleet would be vulnerable, concentrated in one location. Roosevelt overruled him. When Richardson continued protesting, Roosevelt relieved him of command in February 1941 and replaced him with Admiral Husband Kimmel. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto watched this deployment with deep concern. Yamamoto was 56 years old, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War who had lost 2 fingers at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. Unlike many colleagues, he knew America intimately. He had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington. He had traveled across America, visited oil fields in Texas, toured factories in Detroit. He understood American industrial capacity, and he believed war with the United States would be catastrophic for Japan. But Japan's military was dominated by the army, which pushed for continued expansion. In July 1941, Japanese forces occupied southern Indochina, moving within striking distance of the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and the Philippines. Roosevelt's response was swift and devastating. On July 26th, he froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch government in exile immediately followed. In one stroke, Japan lost access to 75% of its overseas trade and 88% of its imported oil. Japan now had two options: retreat from China and Southeast Asia, abandoning a decade of conquest, or secure resources by force. The military leadership chose war. But there was a problem: the US Pacific Fleet. Any move south would leave Japanese supply lines exposed to American attack. The fleet at Pearl Harbor was described by Yamamoto and his colleagues as a dagger pointed at Japan's throat. If war was inevitable, Yamamoto concluded, Japan must strike first. Destroy the Pacific Fleet in a single devastating blow, buy 6 months to fortify conquered territories, then force America to negotiate a settlement. It was a plan born of desperation. Yamamoto himself reportedly said, "I can run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, I have utterly no confidence." Through fall 1941, negotiations continued in Washington. But in Tokyo, Yamamoto was already training pilots. They practiced in Kagoshima Bay in southern Kyushu, using it as a stand-in for Pearl Harbor's geography, rehearsing low-altitude torpedo runs again and again. On November 26th, the 6 carriers departed Japanese waters: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. They sailed under radio silence, following a northern route through rough seas rarely travelled by merchant ships. In Washington that same day, Secretary of State Cordell Hull delivered America's final position: complete withdrawal from China and Indochina. Tokyo viewed it as an ultimatum. The carriers continued steaming east. December 6, 1941. The strike force reached its launch point roughly 230 nautical miles north of Oahu. Final reconnaissance confirmed the fleet was in harbour. But Yamamoto's intelligence had missed one critical detail. The 3 aircraft carriers based at Pearl Harbor, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port. Enterprise was returning from delivering marine aircraft to Wake Island. Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway. Saratoga was undergoing maintenance in San Diego. The carriers, the most valuable targets, the ships that would determine the future of naval warfare, would escape untouched. At 6 a.m. on December 7th, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo gave the order: prepare to launch the first wave. Japan did not wait for America's response. While fires still burned at Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces were already moving across the Pacific and Southeast Asia in a coordinated offensive of stunning scope. The attack on Hawaii was merely one piece of a grand strategy to seize the resource-rich territories of Asia before the Western powers could respond. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers struck American airfields in the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur received early reports of the Pearl Harbor attack, but confused communications and command delays left his air forces largely unprepared. Japanese aircraft destroyed a large portion of the Far East Air Force on the ground, including many B-17 bombers and P-40 fighters at Clark Field and Eber Field. Initial landings began December 8th at Bataan Island in the north. 2 days later, Japanese troops landed at Apari and other points on Luzon. The main invasion forces would follow. MacArthur commanded roughly 100,000 Filipino soldiers and 20,000 American troops, about 120,000 total, though they were poorly equipped and inadequately trained. His plan to defend the beaches collapsed within days. By late December, Manila was indefensible. MacArthur declared it an open city and withdrew his forces to the Bataan Peninsula, a rugged jungle stronghold west of Manila Bay. There, surrounded and cut off they would make their stand. But the Philippines were just one target. On December 8th, Japan invaded Thailand and British Malaya simultaneously. Thailand, facing overwhelming force, surrendered within hours and became a Japanese ally. In Malaya, Japanese troops pushed south through supposedly impenetrable jungle, outflanking British defensive positions designed to face a seaborne invasion. British commanders had considered the Malayan jungle impassable for large forces. The Japanese proved them catastrophically wrong. Soldiers on bicycles moved faster than British forces could retreat, while superior Japanese air power dominated the skies. On December 10th, Japanese aircraft sank 2 British capital ships off the Malayan coast, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. It was the first time aircraft had sunk modern battleships maneuvering in open water. The age of the battleship was ending. The age of the aircraft carrier had arrived. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, 1941, after 18 days of fighting. Wake Island held out until December 23rd, its small marine garrison inflicting heavy casualties before being overwhelmed. The defenders sank the destroyers Hayate and Kisaragi during the first Japanese landing attempt and shot down dozens of aircraft before the inevitable surrender. To the south, Japanese forces invaded the Dutch East Indies, targeting the oil fields that had been the strategic objective all along. Borneo fell in January, Sumatra in February, Java in March. The oil Japan desperately needed was now flowing to the empire. On February 15, 1942, Singapore surrendered. It was Britain's greatest military disaster. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, supposedly impregnable fortress of the British Empire, fell in 70 days. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered 85,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops to a Japanese force of 36,000. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. The conquerors were brutal. In Singapore, Japanese troops massacred thousands of ethnic Chinese civilians suspected of anti-Japanese sentiments. In Manila, in Hong Kong, across occupied territories, similar atrocities followed. Back in the Philippines, the situation grew desperate. Is less than Hashone, 5 hash is greater than. MacArthur's forces on Bataan were starving. Much material was prioritized for Britain and the European theatre under the Germany First strategy, limiting what reached the Philippines. Rations were cut to less than 1,000 calories per day. Disease, malaria, dysentery, dengue fever ravaged the troops. On March 11th, 1942, President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to evacuate to Australia. The general was too valuable to risk capture. MacArthur, his family, and key staff escaped by PT boat through the Japanese blockade under cover of darkness. Upon reaching Australia, MacArthur made a promise to the Filipino people and the troops he had left behind: "I shall return." It would become the most famous statement of the Pacific War. But for the men still trapped on Bataan, it rang hollow. On April 9th, 76,000 Filipino and American troops on Bataan surrendered, the largest surrender in American military history. What followed became known as the Bataan Death March. Japanese forces, unprepared for so many prisoners, forced the captives to march 65 miles to prison camps in brutal heat. Men already weakened by months of starvation and disease were beaten, bayoneted, shot for falling behind. Those who stopped for water were killed. Estimates vary widely, but roughly 500 to 650 Americans died during the march or immediately after, along with between 5,000 and 10,000 Filipinos. On May 6th, the last American holdout, the fortress island of Corregidor in Manila Bay, surrendered. The Philippines were lost. By the spring of 1942, Japan's empire had reached its maximum extent. The conquests were staggering. In 5 months, Japan had seized territory containing roughly 400 to 450 million people across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The empire now stretched from the borders of India to the mid-Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands south to the approaches of Australia. Japan controlled the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the rice fields of Burma and Indochina. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that Tokyo had envisioned for decades was now reality. But this rapid success contained the seeds of disaster. The empire was vast but overextended. Supply lines stretched thousands of miles across hostile waters. Occupation troops were spread thin across conquered territories where local populations harbored deep resentment. And most critically, Japan lacked the industrial capacity to defend what it had conquered. The empire had won its gamble on speed and surprise, but now it faced an opponent with 10 times its industrial capacity, who was already mobilizing for total war. In America, the shock of Pearl Harbor and the humiliation of the Philippines' defeats had transformed public opinion overnight. Isolationism vanished. Factories converted to war production. Millions volunteered for service. And Washington was already planning its counterstrike. The rising sun had reached its zenith. Soon it would begin its descent. America needed to strike back. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed invincible. The empire's conquests continued unchecked across Asia. American morale was at its lowest point. President Roosevelt understood that America needed a psychological victory, something to prove that Japan itself was vulnerable. The problem was distance. Japan lay 5,000 miles from the American west coast. No land-based bomber had the range to reach Tokyo and return. Aircraft carriers could get close enough, but carrier-based aircraft were too small to carry meaningful bomb loads that far inland. Then someone had an audacious idea. What if Army bombers could take off from a Navy aircraft carrier? It had never been done before. Army B-25 Mitchell bombers weighed over 30,000 pounds, fully loaded, and needed long runways. An aircraft carrier's flight deck was barely 500 feet long. But tests in February 1942 proved it could work, barely. With modifications to reduce weight and maximize fuel capacity, AB-25 could stagger into the air from a carrier deck. Landing back on the carrier was impossible. The bombers would have to fly to China after the raid and hope to reach airfields in territory not controlled by Japan. The man chosen to lead this desperate mission was Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, is less than Hajon. 0 hash is greater than. Doolittle was 45 years old, a legend in aviation circles. He held a doctorate in aeronautics from MIT, had won air racing championships, and pioneered instrument flying. If anyone could pull off this suicide mission, it was Doolittle. He called for volunteers. Every man in his unit stepped forward. Doolittle selected 80 men, 16 5-man crews, and began intensive training at Eglin Field in Florida. They practiced short takeoffs again and again, studied models of Tokyo, and rehearsed low-altitude flying over water. None were told where they were going, but they all knew this was a one-way mission. On April 2nd, 1942, the USS Hornet departed San Francisco Bay. Lashed to her deck were 16 B-25 bombers, the largest planes ever to sit on a carrier. Task Force 16, commanded by Admiral William Halsey on the USS Enterprise, would provide escort. The crew spent 2 weeks at sea, making final preparations. Someone had obtained old Japanese friendship medals from before the war. The crews wired them to their bombs with sardonic messages. These were the greetings they would send to the Emperor. The plan called for the Hornet to approach within 400 miles of Japan on April 18th, launch the bombers around noon, bomb Tokyo and other cities in the afternoon, then fly west to land at Chinese airfields at night. But on the morning of April 18th, roughly 650 nautical miles from Tokyo, about 750 miles, the task force spotted a Japanese picket boat. The Nitto Maru immediately began transmitting radio warnings before American ships could sink it. The element of surprise was compromised. Admiral Halsey and Colonel Doolittle made a split-second decision: launch immediately. The extra distance meant none of the bombers would have enough fuel to reach the Chinese airfields. The crews would have to crash land or bail out over China and hope for the best. At 8:20 a.m., the Hornet turned into the wind. Waves crashed over the bow, and the carrier pitched in heavy seas. Doolittle's bomber, first in line, began its takeoff roll. The B-25 gathered speed down the pitching deck. At the last possible moment, as the bow dropped, Doolittle pulled back on the controls. The bomber staggered into the air with barely 20 feet to spare. One by one, the other 15 bombers followed. All 16 made it safely airborne, a minor miracle. 7 hours later, the bombers approached the Japanese coast flying at treetop level. They climbed to about 1,200 feet over Tokyo, just high enough for a bombing run, still low enough to evade most radar. Air raid sirens did not sound. People on the streets looked up in confusion. Some waved, thinking they were Japanese planes. Then the bombs began falling. Doolittle's targets were industrial facilities and military installations in Tokyo, but his bombs also fell on residential areas. Other crews hit Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. The damage was minimal. This was a pinprick, not a knockout blow. But the psychological impact was devastating. For the first time since the 13th century, foreign weapons had struck the Japanese home islands. The sacred realm was vulnerable. The emperor's military had failed to protect him. After releasing their bombs, the 16 B-25s turned west and ran for China. As darkness fell, the crews faced their final crisis: fuel running out, weather deteriorating, unable to locate the Chinese airfields in the dark. 15 crews bailed out or crash-landed in China. One diverted to the Soviet Union and was interned. 2 men drowned when their plane ditched in the ocean. 8 were captured by Japanese forces in occupied China. 3 of those captured were executed after show trials. A 4th died in captivity. The remaining 4 survived Japanese prison camps until war's end. 74 of the 80 raiders ultimately survived the war. The physical damage to Japan was negligible, but America's spirits soared. The raid proved Japan could be struck, that America could fight back, that the war was not lost. And in Tokyo, the humiliation was complete. Admiral Yamamoto became obsessed with destroying America's aircraft carriers before they could strike again. His obsession would lead him to a tiny speck in the Pacific called Midway. May 1942. While Doolittle's raiders were still making their way home from China, American codebreakers intercepted disturbing Japanese communications. A major Japanese offensive was forming. The target, Port Moresby in New Guinea and Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. If Japan secured these positions, they would control the approaches to Australia and cut the lifeline between America and its only remaining major ally in the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, moved to intercept. He coordinated multiple carrier task forces, notably Task Force 17, centered on Yorktown, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, and the force built around Lexington, sending them to the Coral Sea northeast of Australia. What followed would change naval warfare forever. On May 7th, American scout planes spotted Japanese ships approaching New Guinea. The carriers Lexington and Yorktown launched their aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. At the same moment, Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku were launching their own strikes. The opposing squadrons passed each other in the sky, each hunting the other's fleet. Neither carrier fleet ever came within visual range of the other. The Battle of the Coral Sea would be fought entirely by aircraft across 200 miles of open ocean, the first naval battle in history where carriers never exchanged direct fire. American dive bombers found the light carrier Shoho escorting the Port Moresby invasion convoy. They swarmed the small carrier with devastating effect. Multiple bombs and torpedoes struck home. Shoho sank in minutes. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon radioed back the exultant message, "Scratch one flat top." But the Japanese strike found the American oiler Neosho and destroyer Sims, mistaking them for a carrier and cruiser. Both ships were sunk. The main American carriers remained undetected, for now. May 8th brought the main engagement. Both fleets launched full strikes almost simultaneously at dawn. Again, the opposing squadrons crossed paths in the sky, each racing to destroy the other's carriers first. Japanese aircraft found Yorktown and Lexington. Yorktown took a single bomb hit, but remained operational. Lexington absorbed 2 torpedo hits and several bombs. At first, she seemed to survive, her damage control teams containing the fires. American aircraft struck back, hitting Shokaku with 3 bombs that tore through her flight deck. The carrier was heavily damaged but remained afloat. Zuikaku escaped into a rain squall but lost most of her aircraft. Both sides withdrew, bloodied. Then disaster struck the Lexington. Hours after the battle, gasoline vapors from ruptured fuel lines ignited deep within the ship. Explosions ripped through her hull. By late afternoon, the fires were uncontrollable. The crew abandoned ship, and American destroyers torpedoed Lady Lex to prevent her capture. The Battle of the Coral Sea ended as a tactical draw. America lost a fleet carrier, a destroyer, and an oiler. Japan lost a light carrier and had a fleet carrier heavily damaged. But strategically, it was an American victory. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby was cancelled. Australia remained secure, and critically, both Shokaku and Zuikaku would be unavailable for Japan's next major operation. More importantly, both navies had learned a new reality. The age of the battleship was over. The aircraft carrier now ruled the seas. And 1 month later, at a tiny atoll called Midway, this new kind of warfare would decide the fate of the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was not satisfied. The Doolittle raid had humiliated Japan, proving that American carriers could strike the homeland with impunity. Coral Sea had been inconclusive. Japan's advance toward Australia halted, but at acceptable cost. Yamamoto knew that to secure Japan's empire, he must destroy America's remaining aircraft carriers. He conceived an elaborate trap. The target would be Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway housed an American airbase and submarine refueling station. More importantly, it was close enough to Pearl Harbor that the Americans would have to defend it. Yamamoto's plan was complex, involving multiple task forces spread across thousands of miles. A diversionary force would strike the Aleutian Islands in the north, drawing American attention. Meanwhile, 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carrying about 248 aircraft, would strike Midway. Behind them, Yamamoto would follow with the main surface fleet, including the new super battleship Yamato, intended to support the operation. When the American carriers came to defend Midway, Japanese carriers would ambush and destroy them. Then the battleships would finish any survivors. It was a brilliant plan, but it had one fatal flaw. The Americans were reading Japan's mail. Since early 1942, American cryptanalysts, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been breaking Japanese naval codes. They intercepted messages referring to a major operation against target AF. But where was AF? Rochefort devised a clever test. He had Midway send an uncoded message reporting that their fresh water distillation plant had broken down. Days later, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese message: AF is short of water. Admiral Nimitz now knew Yamamoto's target, his timing, and his strength. He sent everything he had. Task Force 16, carriers Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, departed Pearl Harbor on May 28th. Task Force 17, the damaged Yorktown, hastily repaired in just 3 days, followed on May 30th, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher. By June 2nd, both American task forces were positioned 200 miles northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. Yamamoto had no idea they were there. The trap was set, but this time it was an American trap. June 4th, 1942. Around 4:30 a.m. local time. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier strike force, launched his first wave against Midway, 108 aircraft. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters climbed into the pre-dawn darkness and set course for the atoll. Around 6:30 a.m., the Japanese strike hit Midway. They bombed fuel tanks, destroyed buildings, and damaged the runway. But Midway's defenders had been alerted by radar. American aircraft had already taken off, and anti-aircraft fire was fierce. The Japanese strike leader radioed back, "A second attack is necessary." This message would doom the Japanese fleet. Nagumo faced a decision. He had held back a second wave of 93 aircraft, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, weapons designed for attacking ships in case American carriers appeared. Should he launch them at Midway, or keep them ready for naval combat? Around 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made his choice. Rearm the aircraft for a second strike on Midway. Crews on the 4 carriers began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with land attack bombs. Torpedoes were stacked on hangar decks. Bombs were loaded onto aircraft. The carriers' decks became arsenals. Then, around 7:28 a.m., a Japanese scout plane radioed a devastating message. 10 enemy surface ships sighted. Nagumo demanded clarification. What kind of ships? Minutes ticked by with no answer. Finally, around 8:09 a.m., 40 minutes later, the scout plane confirmed. The enemy force includes what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo now faced chaos. His aircraft were armed for land attack, not ship attack. His first wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel, needing to land immediately. American aircraft from Midway were already attacking his carriers, obsolete torpedo bombers and fighters that his combat air patrol shredded, but they tied up his defences. Nagumo made another fateful decision. Recover the Midway strike first, then rearm everything for naval attack, then launch a massive coordinated strike. It would take time. Time he did not have. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, the American carriers had launched everything they had. Enterprise and Hornet sent their squadrons around 7 a.m. Yorktown launched an hour later. 151 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, were racing toward the Japanese fleet. But the strike was uncoordinated. Radio silence meant squadrons could not communicate. Squadrons became separated. Some navigated poorly and missed the target entirely. The first to arrive were the torpedo bombers, slow, obsolete Douglas Devastators carrying Mark 13 torpedoes that often malfunctioned. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet found the Japanese carriers around 9:20 a.m. 15 aircraft, flying low and slow, attacked without fighter escort. Japanese Zeros fell on them like wolves. One by one, the Devastators were shot down. Burning aircraft tumbled into the sea. Of 15 planes, 14 were destroyed. Only one man survived, Ensign George Gay, floating in the water, watching the battle unfold. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next. 10 aircraft. 10 shot down. No survivors. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown followed. 12 aircraft. 10 shot down. In less than 20 minutes, losses were catastrophic. 41 torpedo bombers attacked. 35 were destroyed. Not a single torpedo hit its target. It seemed like a catastrophic failure, but the sacrifice of the torpedo bombers had accomplished something critical. They had drawn every Japanese fighter down to wave level. Around 10:22 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 33 dive bombers from Enterprise through a gap in the clouds. Below him, spread across the blue Pacific, were 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Their decks were crowded, with aircraft being fueled and armed. Fuel lines snaked across the decks. Bombs and torpedoes sat exposed. Every Japanese fighter was at sea level, having just slaughtered the torpedo bombers. The sky above the carriers was empty. McCluskey pushed over into his dive. 32 other aircraft followed. At the same moment, dive bombers from Yorktown arrived over Soryu. The next 5 minutes would change the war. Douglas Dauntless dive bombers screamed down from 14,000 feet. 1,000-pound bombs fell away, guiding toward their targets. The first bomb struck Akagi near the center elevator. It penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar, where aircraft were being fueled and armed. The explosion triggered secondary explosions. Fuel ignited. Torpedoes detonated. Within seconds, Akagi was a roaring inferno. Kaga took 4 direct hits. Her flight deck erupted in flame. Explosions tore through her hangar decks. Hundreds of men died in the first minutes. Soryu took 3 bombs in rapid succession. All 3 hit among aircraft being prepared for launch. The carrier became a blazing wreck. In 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were mortally wounded. On Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo stood in stunned silence. His flagship was dying beneath him. Reluctantly, he transferred to a cruiser. But 1 Japanese carrier remained. Hiryu, operating separately from the other 3, had escaped the American dive bombers. Around 10:40 a.m., even as her sister ships burned, Hiryu launched a counterattack. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters found Yorktown. 3 bombs struck home. Yorktown's boilers went offline. She lay dead in the water. Around 2:45 p.m., Hiryu launched a second strike, 10 torpedo bombers. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown's port side. The carrier began to list dangerously. Around 5 p.m., Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandon ship. But Hiryu's triumph was short-lived. Around 5 p.m., 24 dive bombers from Enterprise found her. 4 bombs struck the carrier. Like her sisters, Hiryu erupted in flames. By nightfall on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were burning or sinking. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu would sink that night. Hiryu would follow at dawn. Yamamoto, still hundreds of miles away with his battleships, received the catastrophic news. His plan had collapsed. His carriers were gone. Early on June 5th, he ordered the withdrawal. The Battle of Midway was over. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, about 248 aircraft, and roughly 3,000 men, including many of its most experienced pilots. America lost 1 carrier, approximately 145 aircraft, and 307 men. More critically, Japan lost the strategic initiative. Large-scale offensive operations were effectively over. No longer could it expand. No longer could it dictate the war's tempo. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide had turned. Now it was America's turn to attack. After Midway, the question became where to strike next. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, and General Douglas MacArthur both wanted to go on the offensive. But they disagreed on where. MacArthur wanted to drive through New Guinea toward the Philippines. King wanted to secure the Solomon Islands and protect the supply line to Australia. In July 1942, reconnaissance flights discovered something alarming. The Japanese were building an airfield on Guadalcanal, a jungled island in the southern Solomons. From that airfield, Japanese bombers could strike Allied shipping lanes to Australia. They could threaten New Zealand. They could turn the entire South Pacific into a Japanese lake. The airfield had to be taken. Admiral Nimitz ordered the 1st Marine Division to seize Guadalcanal and the nearby island of Tulagi. The operation was codenamed Watchtower. Marines called it Operation Shoestring because of inadequate planning, insufficient supplies, and incomplete intelligence. Most of the 19,000 Marines assigned to the invasion were teenagers who had never seen combat. They had trained in New Zealand for barely a month. Their maps were drawn from incomplete aerial photographs and outdated charts. Nobody knew how many Japanese defended the island or where they were positioned. The assault was scheduled for August 7th, 1942, 8 months to the day after Pearl Harbor. Admiral Frank Fletcher commanded the carrier task force, providing air cover, Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp. He was nervous about exposing his carriers to Japanese land-based bombers from Rabaul, 600 miles to the northwest. His concerns would prove prophetic. At dawn on August 7th, the invasion fleet appeared off Guadalcanal. Cruisers and destroyers opened fire on the northern coast, pounding the beach and jungle beyond with high-explosive shells. The bombardment lasted nearly 2 hours. At 9:10 a.m., the first wave of Marines hit Red Beach on the northern shore. They expected hell. They found an empty beach. The Japanese construction workers and troops, about 2,300 men, had withdrawn into the jungle. Some fled east along the coast. Others melted into the mountainous interior. The Americans waded ashore unopposed, advancing cautiously through coconut groves, expecting ambush at any moment. By afternoon, Marines were pushing inland through oppressive heat and humidity. The temperature reached 95 degrees. Humidity approached 100%. Men carrying 70 pounds of equipment collapsed from heat exhaustion. On August 8th, Marines reached the airfield. The Japanese had fled so quickly they left meals half-eaten, equipment scattered, construction vehicles abandoned. The runway was nearly complete. Another few weeks, and Japanese aircraft would have been operating from it. The Marines immediately renamed it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a dive bomber pilot killed at Midway. Engineers began preparing the runway for American aircraft. That night, disaster struck offshore. Is less than Hashone. 5 hash is greater than. The Battle of Savo Island would become the worst naval defeat in American history. When dawn broke on August 9th, the Marines watched 4 Allied cruisers burning and sinking in the waters north of the island. More than 1,000 Allied sailors were dead. Worse, Admiral Fletcher, unnerved by Japanese air attacks on his carriers, withdrew his task force south on August 9th. The transports, only partially unloaded, fled with him. The Marines were stranded. 19,000 men held a narrow perimeter around Henderson Field, with limited ammunition, inadequate food, and no certainty of resupply. They had no heavy artillery. They had no tanks. They controlled the airfield, but had no aircraft to fly from it. On August 12th, Japanese bombers from Rabaul struck Henderson Field in the first of what would become daily raids. That night, Japanese destroyers shelled the airfield, forcing Marines into foxholes while explosions tore through the runway and surrounding jungle. But on August 20th, the first American aircraft arrived. 19 Wildcat fighters and 12 Dauntless dive bombers, flown in from the carrier Long Island. Henderson Field was operational. The Marines now had air support. It was just in time. The Japanese had landed reinforcements east of the Marine perimeter. On the night of August 21st, 900 Japanese troops attacked across the Tenaru River in a banzai charge, a mass frontal assault with fixed bayonets, screaming soldiers running directly into American machine gun fire. It was slaughter. American machine guns cut down wave after wave of attackers. When dawn broke, 777 Japanese soldiers lay dead in front of the Marine positions. Only 15 survived to be captured. The Americans lost 44 men. The ferocity shocked the Marines. These were not soldiers who would surrender when defeated. They were fanatics who would die to the last man. Through September and October, the battle intensified. Every night, Japanese destroyers raced down from Rabaul in what the Americans called the Tokyo Express. Fast nighttime runs, delivering troops and supplies, then racing back north before dawn brought American aircraft. The Marines called it the Rat Run. Japanese reinforcements poured onto the island. By mid-September, over 6,000 Japanese troops surrounded Henderson Field. They attacked repeatedly: night assaults, artillery bombardments, infiltration attempts. The Marines held, but barely. Disease ravaged both sides. Malaria infected nearly every man on the island. Dysentery turned men into walking skeletons. Tropical ulcers ate through flesh to the bone. Men shook with fever in 100-degree heat. Food ran short. Marines survived on 2 meals a day of captured Japanese rice. They called it Guadalcanal stew. Some days, 1 meal. Men lost 30, 40, 50 pounds. Sleep became impossible. Japanese artillery shelled Henderson Field nightly. During the day, bombers from Rabaul struck at noon with such regularity that Marines called it Tojo time. Men dug into foxholes and prayed. October brought the crisis. Japanese reinforcements built to over 20,000 troops. On October 23rd, they launched a massive coordinated assault. For 3 days and nights, Japanese forces attacked the Marine perimeter in wave after wave. The Marines held a ridge south of Henderson Field that became known as Bloody Ridge. Japanese soldiers attacked uphill into machine gun fire and artillery. When ammunition ran low, Marines fought hand-to-hand with knives and entrenching tools. By October 26th, the Japanese attack collapsed. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the slopes of Bloody Ridge. The Marines lost fewer than 300. At sea, carrier battles raged. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in late August. The Battle of Cape Esperance in October. The Battle of Santa Cruz in late October, where Carrier Hornet was sunk, but Japanese losses in aircraft and pilots were irreplaceable. In mid-November came the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, 2 nights of brutal surface combat in the waters north of the island. Battleships slugged it out at point-blank range. Ships rammed each other. The battleship Hiei was sunk. So was the cruiser Atlanta. 2 American admirals died in the fighting. But the Japanese lost. Their reinforcement convoys were turned back. The Tokyo Express could no longer run. By December, starvation gripped Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. Cut off from supplies, soldiers ate roots and leaves. Thousands died of malnutrition and disease. In February 1943, Japan evacuated its survivors. Over 3 nights, destroyers rescued 11,000 men, skeletal, sick, defeated. The battle for Guadalcanal was over. 7,000 Americans had died on the island and in the surrounding waters. 31,000 Japanese soldiers perished, most from disease and starvation. But America had proven it could fight. And win. The night of August 8th, 1942. The Marines were ashore on Guadalcanal, the airfield secured. Offshore, Admiral Fletcher's carriers had withdrawn south, but the invasion fleet remained, cargo ships still unloading supplies, protected by a screen of cruisers and destroyers. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded the amphibious force. He positioned his screening force in 2 groups north and south of Savo Island, a small volcanic cone guarding the approaches to the landing beaches. The Northern Group, 3 cruisers, Vincennes, Astoria, and Quincy, with 2 destroyers. The Southern Group, cruisers, HMAS Canberra and USS Chicago, with 2 destroyers. A third group of 2 cruisers patrolled to the east. It seemed adequate, but the Americans were unprepared for what approached through the darkness. 600 miles north at Rabaul, Japanese Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa had assembled a strike force. 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer. Their mission: destroy the American transports and leave the Marines stranded without supplies. Mikawa's force raced south at high speed, reaching the waters off Guadalcanal after nightfall. Japanese crews had trained extensively for night combat. They had superior optical equipment, powerful binoculars, and night scopes. They had perfected tactics for coordinated torpedo attacks in darkness. The Americans, by contrast, had barely trained for night surface action. They relied on radar, but the technology was primitive and operators were inexperienced. Most critically, they did not expect a night attack. 1:30 a.m., August 9th. Japanese lookouts spotted the southern screening force. Mikawa's ships were in single column, moving at 30 knots, undetected. They launched reconnaissance float planes that dropped flares, illuminating the Allied ships against the dark water. On the bridge of HMAS Canberra, Australian sailors saw the flares but did not recognize them as hostile. Minutes later, torpedoes slammed into Canberra's starboard side. Simultaneously, 8-inch shells tore through her superstructure. The cruiser was engulfed in flames within minutes. Her captain was killed instantly. Power failed. The ship lost steering. She began to list. USS Chicago, next in line, took a torpedo hit that blew off part of her bow. Confused, her captain turned away, thinking he was under submarine attack. Chicago steamed south, taking no further part in the battle. The Japanese column raced past the southern group and turned north toward the second American force. Aboard Vincennes, Astoria, and Quincy, sailors slept at their battle stations. The ships cruised at 12 knots on routine patrol. Lookouts saw flares to the south, but no alarm was raised. At 1:44 a.m., searchlights blazed from the darkness. Japanese cruisers illuminated all 3 American ships simultaneously. Shells rained down before the Americans could react. Astoria took shells into her bridge and forward turrets. Fires erupted. Her captain staggered from the flaming bridge, badly wounded. She tried to return fire, but her gun directors were destroyed. Quincy swung hard left to unmask her guns. Too late. Japanese shells struck her bridge, killing her captain and most of the bridge crew instantly. Torpedoes hit her port side. She listed heavily, fires consuming her superstructure. Vincennes took hits from 3 directions at once. Japanese cruisers had divided, attacking from both flanks. Within minutes, Vincennes was a burning wreck. Her mainmast collapsed, her bridge destroyed, fires raging out of control. The entire engagement lasted 32 minutes. By 2:16 a.m., Mikawa ordered his forces to withdraw. His ships had suffered minor damage. The American and Australian screen was annihilated. As dawn broke, the scale of the disaster became clear. HMAS Canberra was abandoned at 4 a.m., listing heavily and on fire. American destroyers torpedoed her to prevent capture. She sank at 800 a.m. Astoria fought her fires through the night. At noon on August 9th, she capsized and sank. Quincy sank at 2:35 a.m., just 20 minutes after the battle ended. She went down so fast that many men were trapped below decks. Vincennes stayed afloat until 5 a.m., giving her crew time to abandon ship. She rolled over and sank at 5:15 a.m. 1,077 Allied sailors died. Over 700 were wounded. Japanese casualties: 58 dead, 53 wounded. It was the worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy. Why had Mikawa withdrawn? His primary targets, the transports, remained undefended. He could have destroyed them all, leaving the Marines without supplies or reinforcements. But Mikawa feared Dawn would bring American carrier aircraft. He did not know Fletcher's carriers had withdrawn. Unwilling to risk his cruisers, he retreated north. It was a strategic mistake that saved the Guadalcanal campaign. But for the Marines watching from shore, as 4 cruisers burned and sank, it was a nightmare. Their naval protection was gone. They were alone. The battle taught painful lessons. American overconfidence had been shattered. Japanese night fighting skills had been proven superior. The Navy would have to learn, adapt, and improve. Those lessons would be written in blood over the coming months as battles raged in the waters around Guadalcanal. After Savo Island, the Marines on Guadalcanal were truly alone. The naval disaster had driven away the transports before they could fully unload. The 19,000 Marines held Henderson Field with limited ammunition, inadequate medical supplies, and food for only a few weeks. They had no heavy weapons. They controlled an airfield but barely had aircraft to defend it. Their enemy was not just the Japanese. Guadalcanal itself was a hostile environment. Daytime temperatures reached 100 degrees, with humidity near saturation. Sudden rainstorms turned the ground into knee-deep mud. The jungle was impenetrable without machetes. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, carrying malaria and dengue fever. Within weeks, half the Marines would be sick. But first came the Japanese counterattack. Tokyo had initially dismissed Guadalcanal as a minor setback. Now they recognized its strategic importance. If Henderson Field remained in American hands, Japanese supply lines to the South Pacific would be cut. The Empire's entire defensive perimeter would collapse. The Japanese 17th Army was ordered to retake the island. On the night of August 18th, 900 soldiers of the Ichiki detachment landed east of the marine perimeter. Their commander, Colonel Kianao Ichiki, had fought in China and Manchuria. He held American Marines in contempt. He believed one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. He was wrong. On the night of August 21st, Ichiki launched a frontal assault across the Tenaru River. His soldiers fixed bayonets and charged in a human wave, screaming war cries, running directly into Marine machine gun positions. The Marines opened fire. Tracer rounds lit up the night. Machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers ran into the fire and died. When dawn broke, 777 Japanese bodies lay in front of the Marine lines. Colonel Ichiki, surrounded by his dead men, burned his regimental colours and committed suicide. 15 Japanese soldiers survived to be captured. The Marines lost 44 killed. But the Japanese were not finished. Throughout September and October, the Tokyo Express ran nightly. Fast Japanese destroyers raced down from Rabaul under cover of darkness, landed troops and supplies, then fled north before dawn brought American aircraft. The Americans called it the Rat Run. By mid-September, over 6,000 Japanese reinforcements had landed. By October, 20,000. They brought artillery. Every night, Japanese 105mm and 150mm guns shelled Henderson Field from positions in the jungle-covered hills. Marines huddled in foxholes as explosions tore through the runway and surrounding coconut groves. The shelling destroyed aircraft, killed pilots in their sleep, and made rest impossible. During the day, bombers from Rabaul struck. 27 Japanese bombers escorted by fighters appeared at noon with such regularity that Marines called it Tojo time. Air raid sirens wailed. Men dove into foxholes and dugouts. Bombs fell. Then the bombers turned north and disappeared. Henderson Field was under attack 24 hours a day, and disease was winning. Malaria infected nearly every man on the island. The fever came in cycles. Men shook with chills in 100-degree heat, then burned with fever reaching 105 degrees. When the fever broke, they were drenched in sweat and weak as children. Quinine helped, but supplies were limited. Dysentery followed. Men lost control of their bowels. They became dehydrated, gaunt, skeletal. Some lost 50 pounds in a month. Tropical ulcers ate through skin. Small cuts became infected in the humid heat. Infections spread rapidly. Ulcers grew until they exposed bone. Without proper antibiotics, men watched their flesh rot. Food ran short. Supply ships could not reach Guadalcanal regularly because of Japanese air attacks. Marines were reduced to 2 meals a day, then 1. They ate captured Japanese rice. They called it Guadalcanal stew. Men joked that the hungrier you were, the better it tasted. But nobody laughed when rations were cut to 1,400 calories per day for men fighting in tropical heat. October brought the crisis. Japanese General Harukichi Hyakutake arrived on Guadalcanal with the main force of the 17th Army. His plan was simple: overwhelm the marine perimeter with superior numbers in a coordinated night assault. 22,000 Japanese troops would attack from 3 directions simultaneously. The assault began on the night of October 23rd. Japanese artillery pounded marine positions for hours. Then came the infantry, wave after wave attacking uphill toward Henderson Field through a ridge south of the airfield. The Marines called it Bloody Ridge. For 3 days and nights, Japanese forces attacked. They came through gaps in barbed wire. They climbed over their own dead. Marines fired until their rifles burned their hands. When machine gun ammunition ran low, men fired rifles. When rifle ammunition ran out, they fought with knives, entrenching tools, and bare hands. The fighting was often at point-blank range. Japanese soldiers broke through the perimeter in several places. Marines counterattacked in hand-to-hand combat. Men grappled in muddy foxholes. The ridge became a slaughterhouse. By October 26th, the Japanese attack collapsed. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The Marines lost fewer than 300. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The Marines were exhausted, sick, and starving. At sea, carrier battles raged through fall. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in late August saw both sides claim victory but achieve nothing decisive. The Battle of Cape Esperance in mid-October was an American tactical victory, but failed to stop Japanese reinforcements. The Battle of Santa Cruz in late October resulted in the loss of Carrier Hornet, though Japanese aircraft losses were catastrophic, pilots they could not replace. Then came mid-November and the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Over 2 nights, November 13th through 15th, American and Japanese warships fought the most brutal surface action of the Pacific War. Battleships exchanged fire at ranges under 3,000 yards. Ships rammed each other. Sailors fought fires while shells exploded around them. The battleship USS South Dakota took 42 hits but survived. The battleship Washington sank the Japanese battleship Kirishima with radar-directed gunfire. Cruiser Juno was torpedoed and exploded, killing all but 10 of her 700-man crew, including the 5 Sullivan brothers, whose deaths on the same ship prompted the sole survivor policy. 2 American admirals died in the fighting, Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott. But the Japanese lost. Their reinforcement convoy, carrying 7,000 troops, was turned back. The Tokyo Express could no longer run. By December, the tide had turned. Cut off from resupply, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal began to starve. Soldiers ate leaves, roots, anything they could find. Disease killed more men than combat. Thousands died of malnutrition, dysentery, and tropical diseases. In late December, Japan made the decision to evacuate. Over 3 nights in early February 1943, Japanese destroyers evacuated 11,000 survivors from Cape Esperance on Guadalcanal's northwest coast. The Americans did not realize an evacuation was occurring until it was complete. The Japanese Navy executed its withdrawal flawlessly. On February 9, 1943, the last Japanese soldier left Guadalcanal. The battle was over. American casualties: 7,000 killed or missing, over 8,000 wounded. Japanese casualties: 31,000 dead, 19,000 from combat, 12,000 from starvation and disease. Both sides had thrown everything into the fight. 6 major naval battles, dozens of air battles, daily ground combat lasting 6 months. But America had won. For the first time in the Pacific War, American forces had defeated the Japanese in sustained ground combat. Henderson Field remained in American hands. The supply line to Australia was secure. More importantly, America had learned how to fight, and Japan had learned it could lose. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had become more than Japan's chief naval strategist. He was a symbol, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the mind behind Japan's early victories, the one man Tokyo believed could still turn the war around. American codebreakers knew exactly where to find him. On April 13, 1943, Station Hypo in Hawaii intercepted a Japanese message detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The message contained everything: departure time, flight path, arrival time, even which officers would accompany him. Commander Edwin Layton brought the intercept to Admiral Nimitz. The question was not whether they could kill Yamamoto. The question was whether they should. Assassinating an enemy commander was legal under the laws of war, but killing Yamamoto would reveal that American codebreakers were reading Japanese communications. If Japan changed their codes, the intelligence advantage would vanish. Nimitz consulted Washington. The decision went to the highest level. President Roosevelt gave the order, "Get Yamamoto." The mission was codenamed Operation Vengeance. The challenge was distance. Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville, over 600 miles round trip from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. No American fighter had that range, except one. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was a twin-engine, twin-boom fighter designed as a high-altitude interceptor. With external fuel tanks, it could fly over 700 miles. More importantly, it was fast, over 400 miles per hour, and heavily armed with 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon is less than Hashone. Zero hash is greater than 18 P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron were selected. Their commander, Major John Mitchell, planned the mission with mathematical precision. They would fly at 50 feet above the ocean to avoid radar detection. They would time the intercept to the minute. 4 planes would attack Yamamoto's aircraft. 14 would fly cover against Japanese fighters. The pilots were not told who they were hunting. They were told only that the target was extremely important. April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid. At 7:10 a.m., the 18 P-38s took off from Henderson Field. They flew in radio silence, navigating by compass and watch, skimming just above the wave tops. For 430 miles they flew over empty ocean, making tiny course corrections, burning fuel at an alarming rate. At 9:33 a.m. they reached Bougainville. And there, exactly on schedule, were 2 Japanese bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from the formation and climbed to attack. The other 2 attack planes followed. The covering force engaged the Japanese fighters. Lanphier attacked the lead bomber, a Mitsubishi G-4M Betty, painted dark green, flying at 4,500 feet. The Japanese bomber dove for the jungle canopy. Lanphier followed, firing bursts from his guns. Smoke erupted from the bomber's right engine. The aircraft rolled left, trailing fire, and plunged into the jungle. The crash was visible from miles away, a column of black smoke rising above the trees. Barber attacked the second bomber, which tried to escape at treetop level. His guns tore through the fuselage and cockpit. The bomber crashed into the ocean. The entire engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. The P-38s turned south and raced for home, pursued by Japanese fighters but outrunning them. 1 Lightning was shot down. The pilot, Lieutenant Raymond Hine, did not survive. The other 17 returned safely to Henderson Field. The next day, Japanese search teams found the wreckage of the first bomber in the jungle. They discovered Admiral Yamamoto's body still strapped in his seat. He had been thrown clear on impact, but died instantly. His white-gloved hand still gripped his katana. Japan kept his death secret for over a month. When the announcement finally came, on May 21st, the nation mourned. Yamamoto was given a state funeral. He was posthumously promoted to Fleet Admiral. But Japan had lost more than a brilliant tactician. Yamamoto understood modern naval warfare. He had recognized the primacy of aircraft carriers when others still worshipped battleships. He knew America's industrial strength and warned against prolonged war. His death removed the one strategist who might have adapted to changing circumstances. His replacements were competent but conventional. They would fight the war Japan was losing rather than find new ways to fight it. For America, Operation Vengeance was a perfect success. The codebreakers' secret remained intact. Japan never suspected their communications were compromised. and Pearl Harbor had been avenged. The hunter had become the hunted, and Japan's greatest admiral was gone. While America fought for Guadalcanal, another campaign unfolded in the fog and cold of the North Pacific. On June 7, 1942, the day after Midway, Japanese forces invaded the Aleutian Islands. It had begun as a diversion for the Midway operation, but after Midway's failure, the occupation of Attu and Kiska became an embarrassing reality. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign troops occupied American soil. The Aleutians are a chain of volcanic islands stretching 1,000 miles west from Alaska toward Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula. The weather is among the worst on Earth, near constant fog, winds exceeding 100 miles per hour, freezing rain, and snow even in summer. Visibility is measured in feet, not miles. Japan held 2,500 troops on Attu and Kiska. They were cold, isolated, and strategically irrelevant. But Washington could not allow American territory to remain occupied. In May 1943, America struck Attu. 11,000 American troops assaulted the island. They expected light resistance. They found hell. The Japanese had fortified the high ground. American troops, many from California, and had never experienced cold weather combat, struggled in freezing temperatures and deep mud. Frostbite and trench foot disabled more men than enemy fire. Weapons froze. Radios failed in the wet cold. The Japanese defended every ridge, every valley. American casualties mounted. What was supposed to take 3 days lasted 19. On May 29th, the Japanese launched their final attack. With ammunition exhausted and defeat certain, 500 Japanese soldiers mounted a banzai charge. They attacked through the fog with bayonets and swords, many armed only with grenades. Some carried grenades in both hands, determined to die and take Americans with them. They overran American positions, breaking through to aid stations where they killed wounded soldiers and medics. American troops fell back in confusion. But gradually, firepower prevailed. The charge collapsed. When dawn broke, the battlefield was littered with Japanese bodies. Many had committed suicide by holding grenades against their stomachs. Of 2,500 Japanese defenders on Attu, 29 survived to be captured. The rest died fighting or killed themselves. American casualties: 550 killed, over 1,000 wounded. But another 1,500 were disabled by frostbite, trench foot, and exposure. In August, 35,000 American troops assaulted Kiska. They landed in fog, advanced cautiously, expecting fierce resistance. They found booby traps, abandoned equipment, and empty bunkers. The Japanese had evacuated 3 weeks earlier under cover of fog, rescuing their entire garrison without the Americans knowing. American troops spent days fighting shadows. Some units fired on each other in the fog. Over 300 Americans were killed or wounded from friendly fire and accidents. The Aleutian campaign achieved nothing strategically. The islands were too remote to threaten either side. More men died from weather than combat. But the campaign revealed something important. Japanese soldiers would fight to annihilation rather than surrender. The fanaticism witnessed on Attu was not an aberration. It was doctrine. As American forces prepared to assault more heavily defended islands, this lesson would prove tragically relevant. While Marines fought for Guadalcanal, America's industrial heartland was winning a different kind of war. President Roosevelt had called America the arsenal of democracy. By 1943, that phrase had become reality. The transformation was staggering. In 1939, American shipyards produced fewer than 100 warships. By 1943, they were launching a new destroyer every week, a new submarine every 4 days, and a new escort carrier every month. The crown jewels were the Essex-class fleet carriers. These were not the converted battle cruisers or makeshift conversions of the early war. These were purpose-built warships designed from the keel up as aircraft carriers. 872 feet long, displacing 27,000 tons, crewed by 2,600 men. Each could carry 90 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. They had armor-plated hangar decks, sophisticated damage control systems, and enough anti-aircraft guns to fill the sky with steel. In 1943 alone, America launched 6 Essex-class carriers. USS Essex in July. Yorktown, named for the carrier lost at Midway in August. Lexington, named for Lady Lex lost at Coral Sea in September. Bunker Hill in October. Intrepid in November. Hornet, the third ship to carry that name, in December. By the end of the war, 17 Essex-class carriers would be commissioned. Japan would build none. The disparity went beyond carriers. American shipyards produced 8 battleships, 48 cruisers, 355 destroyers, and 203 submarines during the war. Japan managed 4 battleships, 9 cruisers, 63 destroyers, and 126 submarines. For every warship Japan built, America built 5. But numbers alone did not tell the story. American ships incorporated technological advantages that multiplied their effectiveness. Radar transformed naval warfare. American ships could detect enemy aircraft at 70 miles and surface ships at 30 miles, even in darkness or storms. Japanese ships remained largely dependent on visual observation. At the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, the battleship Washington used radar to locate and destroy the Japanese battleship Kirishima at 8,000 yards in pitch darkness. American damage control was superior. Compartmentalization, firefighting systems, and trained damage control parties meant American carriers could survive hits that would sink their Japanese counterparts. The carrier, Franklin, would absorb 2 bombs and remain afloat. The carrier Saratoga would survive multiple torpedo hits and return to service. Code breaking gave America eyes into Japanese planning. The intelligence advantage that won Midway continued throughout the war. American submarines used decoded messages to position themselves along Japanese convoy routes. Carrier task forces avoided Japanese concentrations and struck weak points. And there was the Panama Canal, America's strategic lifeline. Ships built on the East Coast could transit to the Pacific in days rather than weeks around South America. Carrier task forces formed, trained, and deployed through the canal. Without it, America's 2-ocean navy would have been impossible. Japan could not match this production. Japanese industry lacked the raw materials, the machine tools, and the skilled workforce. American factories operated 3 shifts around the clock. Women joined the workforce by the millions. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of home front mobilization. Liberty ships were mass-produced using prefabricated sections, reducing construction time from months to weeks. Japan's economy was starving. American submarines were sinking tankers faster than Japan could build them. Oil imports dropped from 5 million barrels annually in 1941 to less than 1 million by 1944. Without oil, Japanese industry ground to a halt. More critically, Japan was losing its most irreplaceable resource: trained pilots. American pilot training programs graduated thousands of aviators annually. New pilots received over 300 hours of flight time before entering combat. Japanese training programs produced fewer pilots with less training. By 1943, Japanese replacement pilots received less than 100 hours of flight time. The experienced Japanese pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, dominated the skies over China, and fought at Coral Sea and Midway were irreplaceable. Once lost, they could not be replaced with pilots of equal skill. American pilots, meanwhile, gained experience, survived, rotated home to train new pilots, and returned to combat. By late 1943, American superiority was overwhelming. Admiral Nimitz had 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, and 12 escort carriers in the Pacific. Japan had 6 carriers total, only 3 fully operational. The industrial tsunami that Yamamoto had feared was about to crash over Japan's island defenses. And the first target was a tiny atoll in the Gilbert Islands that most Americans had never heard of. A place called Tarawa. November 1943. Operation Galvanic, the assault on the Gilbert Islands, marked the beginning of America's island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific. The objective was Tarawa Atoll, specifically Betio Island, 2 miles long and 800 yards wide. A sliver of coral barely rising above the Pacific. But Betio had something Japan would die to protect: an airfield. From Tarawa, Japanese aircraft could strike American supply lines across the Central Pacific. More importantly, Tarawa lay on the direct route to the Marshall Islands and the Marianas. Take Tarawa, and the path to Tokyo opened. Japan knew this. For over a year, construction crews and Korean laborers had turned Betio into a fortress. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki commanded 4,500 Japanese troops, special naval landing forces, elite troops comparable to Marines. The defences were formidable. 500 pillboxes constructed from coconut logs and reinforced concrete. Bunkers with walls 5 feet thick, topped with steel plates salvaged from ships. 8-inch naval guns in reinforced emplacements. Anti-boat obstacles, coconut logs tipped with steel and wire, extended 400 yards offshore. Machine gun positions covered every inch of beach. Interlocking fields of fire meant no approach was safe. The defenders had pre-sighted every sector. Admiral Shibasaki boasted that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The Americans gave themselves 3 days. November 20th, 1943, 5:12 a.m. The USS Maryland, Colorado, and Tennessee, 3 battleships raised from Pearl Harbor's mud and returned to service, opened fire on Betio. 14-inch and 16-inch shells tore through the pre-dawn darkness. The bombardment was meant to obliterate the defences before Marines landed. For nearly 3 hours, over 3,000 tons of shells hammered the tiny island. Smoke and dust obscured everything. Explosions tore through palm groves and concrete bunkers. At 8:54 a.m., the naval guns ceased firing. Bombers and fighters struck for 30 minutes. Then, the first wave of Marines began their approach. 5,200 men of the 2nd Marine Division in the first assault waves. They rode in amphibious tractors, LVTs, that could cross the reef and deliver troops directly onto the beach. Behind them came landing craft carrying additional troops. The intelligence officers had studied tide charts carefully. They predicted 5 feet of water over the reef, enough for landing craft. They were wrong. The tide was neap, a monthly occurrence where tidal range is minimal. Instead of 5 feet of water, there were 3 feet. In many places, just 18 inches. At 9:10 a.m., the first wave hit Red Beach. The amphibious tractors lumbered across the reef and delivered Marines directly onto the beach. But many LVTs were hit by Japanese fire. Burning vehicles littered the waterline. Then came the landing craft. They grounded on the reef 400 to 700 yards from shore. The Marines inside faced an impossible choice: stay in the boats and be destroyed, or go over the side into waist-deep water and wade to shore under fire. They went over the side. Japanese machine gunners had waited through the bombardment in underground bunkers. Now they emerged and opened fire. Water erupted around the Marines as bullets struck. Men weighted down with 70 pounds of equipment struggled through chest-deep water. Some stepped into holes in the reef and drowned. Others were hit and sank. Wounded men drowned when they could not keep their heads above water. The water turned red. Those who reached the beach found no cover. The naval bombardment had destroyed palm trees and surface structures, but left the reinforced bunkers intact. Japanese troops poured fire from concrete pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire. Marines huddled behind a coconut log seawall barely 3 feet high. They were pinned down, unable to advance, taking casualties from mortars and machine guns. By noon on the first day, the assault teetered on the edge of disaster. Over 1,500 Marines were ashore, but they controlled only a few hundred yards of beach. Casualties were horrific. Bodies floated in the lagoon and littered the beach. Wounded men lay in the open, unable to be evacuated, dying under the tropical Sunday. Reinforcements coming ashore at midday faced the same nightmare. Landing craft grounded on the reef. Men waded through water, thick with floating bodies. Some boats took direct hits from Japanese artillery and disintegrated, killing everyone aboard. But gradually, the Marines gained footholds. Individual squads attacked pillboxes with flamethrowers, satchel charges, and grenades. A Marine would crawl to a bunker's firing slit and shove a grenade inside. Others would rush the entrance. Flamethrowers burned defenders alive in their bunkers. Each pillbox was a separate battle. Each yard of ground cost lives. By nightfall on November 20th, 5,000 Marines were ashore on 3 small beachheads. They held positions no more than 300 yards deep. Japanese counterattacks came throughout the night, small probing attacks testing American lines. November 21st brought more reinforcements and more carnage. Marines pushed inland, bunker by bunker. The fighting was point blank, grenades thrown into firing slits, rifles fired around corners, men grappling hand to hand in underground bunkers. By the third day, November 22nd, Marine numbers told. With over 10,000 men ashore, they overwhelmed defensive positions through sheer weight of firepower. Sherman tanks that finally crossed the reef provided mobile firepower, blasting bunkers at close range. On November 23rd, 76 hours after the first landing, Betio was secured. The butcher's bill was devastating. 1,009 Marines killed, over 2,000 wounded. In 3 days of fighting for 2 square miles of coral, American casualties exceeded 30% of the assault force. Of 4,500 Japanese and Korean defenders, only 17 were captured alive. The rest died in their bunkers or committed suicide. 4,490 bodies were counted. A Marine Corps combat cameraman, Lieutenant Lewis Hayward, filmed the entire battle. His footage showed the full horror: bodies floating in the lagoon, Marines cut down on the reef, the aftermath of close combat in bunkers. Military commanders wanted to suppress the footage. It was too graphic, too demoralizing. But President Roosevelt insisted it be released. The American public needed to understand the cost of victory. The footage appeared in newsreels across America in early 1944. The public was shocked, but rather than weaken resolve, it strengthened it. War bond drive surged. Volunteer enlistments increased. Mothers and fathers who had lost sons at Tarawa wanted their sacrifice to mean something. And the military learned. Tarawa taught painful lessons. Pre-invasion bombardment must be longer and heavier. Tidal calculations must be precise. More amphibious tractors were needed. Underwater demolition teams must clear obstacles before assault waves. These lessons would be written into doctrine. They would save lives at Kwajalein, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. But those lessons were purchased with blood on a beach called Betio. 2.5 years after his humiliating evacuation, Douglas MacArthur was coming back. The promise he made in March 1942, "I shall return," had become more than words. It had become personal obsession, strategic necessity, and national redemption rolled into one. By October 1944, MacArthur commanded the largest amphibious force ever assembled in the Pacific. 700 ships, 174,000 troops, 18 aircraft carriers providing air cover. The target was Leyte, a large island in the central Philippines. Strategically, the Philippines were the key to strangling Japan. Oil from the Dutch East Indies flowed through Philippine waters to Japan. Recapture the Philippines, and Japan's fuel supply would be cut. Without oil, the Japanese war machine would grind to a halt. For MacArthur, it was also about honor. He had promised the Filipino people he would return. He had left thousands of American soldiers to die on Bataan and Corregidor. This was his chance to make it right. October 18th, 1944. The pre-invasion bombardment began. For 2 days, naval guns and aircraft pounded Japanese positions on Leyte. The lessons from Tarawa had been learned. This bombardment was longer, heavier, more systematic. Reconnaissance aircraft identified targets. Naval gunfire obliterated them. Bombers struck anything that survived. October 20th, 1944. 10 a.m. The 24th Infantry Division hit the beaches at Leyte Gulf. The landings were almost anticlimactic. Japanese forces had withdrawn inland, choosing to defend from the hills and jungles rather than the exposed beaches. American troops waded ashore, expecting fierce resistance, and found empty sand. Within hours, 60,000 Americans were ashore. Engineers began unloading supplies. Tanks rolled off landing ships. The beachhead expanded rapidly. Filipino guerrillas emerged from the jungle to greet the Americans. For 3 years, they had fought a resistance war against Japanese occupation. Now, American soldiers were handing them weapons and ammunition. Thousands of Filipinos joined the advancing American forces as scouts, guides, and irregular fighters. That afternoon, MacArthur prepared for his moment. He had planned this carefully. Photographers and correspondents were positioned. The landing craft was chosen for its photogenic qualities. Even the beach was selected for maximum visual impact. At 2 p.m., MacArthur's landing craft approached Red Beach. The boat grounded in 3 feet of water. The ramp dropped. MacArthur stepped off into the surf. He wore his trademark crushed cap and aviator sunglasses. His khaki uniform was crisp, despite the tropical heat. He waded ashore through knee-deep water, his face set in a determined expression photographers would capture for history. Behind him came Philippine President Sergio Osmeña and other Filipino officials returning from exile. The cameras rolled. This was MacArthur's theatre, and he was the star. On the beach, a microphone waited. MacArthur stood before it and spoke words that would echo across the Pacific and into history. People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil. Rally to me. Let no heart be faint. The guidance of divine God points the way. Follow in his name to the holy grail of righteous victory. It was vintage MacArthur, grandiose, theatrical, deeply sincere. For the Filipino people who had suffered 3 years of brutal occupation, it meant liberation. For American soldiers who had surrendered on Bataan, it meant vindication. For MacArthur, it meant redemption. But the Japanese were not finished. Tokyo understood that losing the Philippines meant losing the war. Without access to Southeast Asian oil, Japan could not continue fighting. The empire would have to defend the Philippines with everything it had left. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, ordered a desperate gamble. The entire remaining Japanese navy, every battleship, cruiser, destroyer, and carrier that could still sail, would converge on Leyte Gulf. The plan was complex and audacious. Japan's remaining aircraft carriers, now largely empty of planes and pilots, would serve as bait. They would lure Admiral Halsey's powerful carrier force north. Meanwhile, Japanese battleships would race through the Philippine Islands and destroy the American invasion fleet. It was a suicide mission disguised as strategy. The carrier force was being sacrificed. The battleship force would likely be destroyed, even if successful. But if it worked, if they could destroy the transports and leave American troops stranded without supplies, it might buy time. It might force a negotiated peace. It was the last throw of the dice. As MacArthur's forces pushed inland on Leyte, the Japanese Navy steamed toward its final apocalyptic battle. The greatest naval engagement in history was about to begin. October 23rd, 1944, 4:50 a.m. The American submarine USS Data detected a large Japanese force in the Palawan Passage west of the Philippines. 23 warships in column, battleships, cruisers, destroyers. They were heading east at 16 knots toward the Philippines. Data and her sister submarine Dace shadowed the force through the night. At dawn, they struck. Data fired 6 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Atago, flagship of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commander of the Japanese force. 4 hit. The cruiser exploded and sank in 19 minutes. Admiral Kurita was rescued, but had to transfer his flag to the battleship Yamato. Dace torpedoed the cruiser Maya, which blew apart and sank immediately. A third cruiser, Takao, was crippled and forced to withdraw. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had begun. What followed over the next 3 days would be the largest naval battle in history. 4 separate engagements spread across hundreds of miles. Over 200,000 men fighting in ships, submarines, and aircraft. The Japanese plan was already unraveling. Admiral Kurita's center force, 5 battleships, including Yamato and Musashi, 12 cruisers, and 15 destroyers, would transit the Sibuyan Sea, pass through San Bernardino Strait, and attack the American landing beaches from the north. Admiral Nishimura's southern force, 2 battleships and 4 destroyers, would transit Surigao Strait from the south. The 2 forces would catch the Americans in a pincer. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Ozawa's carrier force, 4 carriers with only 116 aircraft total, would operate northeast of Luzon as bait. His job was to be seen to lure Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet north, away from the landing beaches. It depended on perfect timing and American mistakes. October 24th. The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. American search planes from Admiral Halsey's carriers spotted Kurita's center force as it entered the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of American aircraft struck the Japanese ships. The super battleship Musashi became their primary target. At 83,000 tons, Musashi was one of the 2 largest battleships ever built. Her armor was thought to be impenetrable. Her 18-inch guns could destroy any ship afloat. American pilots proved otherwise. Over 5 hours, approximately 260 aircraft from 5 different carriers attacked Musashi in repeated waves. Torpedo bombers came in low. Dive bombers struck from above. Musashi absorbed hit after hit. 19 torpedoes struck her hull. 17 bombs penetrated her armor. Still, she stayed afloat, turning in circles, listing but fighting. Her anti-aircraft guns shot down 18 American aircraft. Finally, at 7:35 p.m., Musashi capsized and sank. Over 1,000 men went down with her. Admiral Kurita, shaken by the relentless air attacks, temporarily reversed course. American pilots reported the Japanese were retreating. But that night, Kurita turned around again and continued toward San Bernardino Strait. Meanwhile, 600 miles to the south, Admiral Nishimura's force was steaming into a trap. October 25th, 2 a.m. The Battle of Surigao Strait. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf commanded the 7th Fleet's Fire Support Group, 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 21 destroyers. 5 of the battleships had been raised from the mud at Pearl Harbor. This was their revenge. Oldendorf positioned his force at the northern exit of Surigao Strait in a classic naval maneuver called Crossing the T. As Japanese ships emerged from the narrow strait in single file, American battleships would be able to fire full broadsides, while the Japanese could only fire their forward guns. American destroyers struck first. They raced down the strait in darkness, launched torpedoes at point-blank range, then turned and fled. Torpedoes struck the battleship Fuso, breaking her in half. Both sections continued to burn and float for hours before sinking. Then came the battleships. At 3:51 a.m., the battleship West Virginia opened fire with her radar-controlled guns. Shells from 14-inch and 16-inch guns rained down on the Japanese column. The battleship Yamashiro was hit repeatedly, caught fire, capsized, and sank. The Battle of Surigao Strait lasted less than an hour. It was the last battleship versus battleship action in history. Only one Japanese destroyer escaped. October 25th, dawn. The Battle of Samar. This was where the Japanese plan nearly succeeded. Admiral Halsey had taken the bait. Ozawa's decoy carrier force had been spotted northeast of Luzon. Halsey, believing Kurita's center force was retreating and Ozawa's carriers were the primary threat, took his entire Third Fleet north. San Bernardino Strait was left unguarded. At 6:37 a.m., Admiral Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, emerged from the strait and turned south toward the landing beaches. Between Kurita and the virtually defenseless transports stood only 3 groups of escort carriers, small, slow carriers designed for anti-submarine warfare. They carried aircraft for ground support, not fleet defense. Their escorts were destroyers and destroyer escorts, small ships with light guns. At 6:44 a.m., Japanese lookouts spotted Taffy, 6 escort carriers with 7 escorts. The Americans were outnumbered and outgunned. Kurita's battleships carried 18-inch, 16-inch, and 14-inch guns. The escort carriers had no armor and could make only 17 knots. Japanese battleships could make 30. It should have been a slaughter. But the Americans fought with desperate courage. The escort carriers turned east and ran, launching every aircraft they had. Planes attacked with whatever they carried: bombs, torpedoes, depth charges, even empty machine guns, making dummy runs to distract Japanese gunners. The destroyers did the impossible. USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, charged directly at the Japanese battleships. A 5,000-ton destroyer attacking 60,000-ton battleships. Johnston fired torpedoes, then used her 5-inch guns to engage cruisers at point-blank range. She was hit repeatedly by 14-inch and 6-inch shells. Her bridge was destroyed. Her engines failed. But she kept fighting until she rolled over and sank. Commander Evans went down with his ship. He would be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort half Johnston's size, also charged the Japanese line. She engaged a heavy cruiser, fired over 600 rounds from her single 5-inch gun, and scored hits on a battleship before being blown apart. The sacrifice of the small boys bought time. Confused by the aggressive attacks, smoke screens, and constant airstrikes, Admiral Kurita believed he faced a much larger force. Japanese ships scattered to engage different targets. The concentrated attack force became dispersed. At 9:25 a.m., with the transports now visible on the horizon, Kurita made an inexplicable decision. He ordered a general withdrawal. His ships turned north and retreated through San Bernardino Strait. The landing beaches were saved. October 25th. The Battle off Cape Engano. Admiral Halsey's carriers found Ozawa's decoy force and destroyed it. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, including Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, is less than Hashone. 0 hash is greater than, but it was a hollow victory. The carriers had few aircraft and were meant to be sacrificed. Halsey had been drawn away from the critical battle. October 25th also saw the first organized kamikaze attacks. Japanese pilots, trained specifically for suicide missions, dove their bomb-laden aircraft into American ships. The escort carrier USS St. Lo was hit by a kamikaze and exploded, sinking in 30 minutes. Other carriers were damaged. The divine wind had begun to blow. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was over. Japanese losses were catastrophic. 4 carriers sunk. 3 battleships sunk, including the mighty Musashi. 10 cruisers sunk. 11 destroyers sunk. Over 10,000 Japanese sailors dead. American losses: 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort. Approximately 3,000 men killed. More importantly, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a fighting force. What remained could not challenge American control of the Pacific. Japan's ships would spend the rest of the war in port, unable to sortie for lack of fuel, unable to train pilots for lack of aircraft. The combined fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered Southeast Asia, and dominated the Western Pacific was gone. America now owned the sea, and the path to Japan lay open. June 15, 1944. Operation Forager, the assault on the Mariana Islands, began with the largest naval force yet assembled in the Pacific. 800 ships, 15 battleships, 21 aircraft carriers, 127,000 assault troops. The target was Saipan, a volcanic island 14 miles long and 5 miles wide in the Mariana Chain. To the north lay Tinian and Guam. Together, these islands would provide air bases from which America's newest bomber could reach Japan. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress had a range of 3,000 miles. From Saipan, Tokyo was 1,250 miles away. From Saipan, American bombers could burn Japan's cities to ash. Japan understood this. Saipan would be defended to the death. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded 32,000 Japanese troops on Saipan. Infantry, artillery, and tank units dug into fortified positions across the island. Unlike Tarawa, where defenders concentrated on the beach, Saipan's defenders held the high ground inland. And there were civilians. Over 22,000 Japanese and Korean civilians lived on Saipan. Most were families of military personnel, administrators, and laborers. For 3 years, Japanese propaganda had told them that Americans were demons who would rape, torture, and kill them. They believed it. The invasion began at 8:43 a.m. on June 15th, with the most intense pre-landing bombardment yet delivered. For 13 days, battleships and aircraft had pounded the island. Now, 8,000 Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions hit 8 beaches simultaneously. Japanese artillery opened fire. Unlike Tarawa, the landings were opposed from the start. Amtraks burned on the beach. Shells exploded among landing craft. But American firepower was overwhelming. By nightfall, 20,000 Marines were ashore despite heavy casualties. That night, Japanese forces launched a massive counterattack. Tanks and infantry charged the Marine positions in waves. Some tanks broke through the lines before being destroyed by bazookas and naval gunfire. Bodies piled up in front of Marine positions. By dawn, the Japanese had lost over 2,000 men and gained nothing. The Americans pushed inland. For 3 weeks, Marines and Army troops fought yard by yard through volcanic ridges, sugarcane fields, and fortified caves. Japanese defenders used the terrain masterfully. Caves honeycombed the island, connected by tunnels. Machine guns, fired from invisible positions. Artillery struck from reverse slopes. Each position had to be cleared with flamethrowers and explosives. The heat was unbearable. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion, carrying 70 pounds of equipment in 95-degree temperatures. Water was rationed. Corpses rotted quickly in the tropical sun, drawing clouds of flies. On June 15, the Battle of the Philippine Sea occurred offshore, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American carrier pilots shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day. Japanese carrier aviation ceased to exist. Japan's last trained carrier pilots died over the Philippine Sea. On Saipan, the battleground toward its horrific conclusion. By early July, Japanese forces had been pushed to Saipan's northern cliffs. General Saito knew defeat was inevitable. On July 6th, he ordered one final attack, a suicidal banzai charge involving every able-bodied man. At 4:45 a.m. on July 7th, over 3,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and walking wounded charged American positions. Many carried rifles. Some had only bayonets lashed to bamboo poles. Others carried only rocks and broken bottles. They overran American positions through sheer numbers and fanaticism. Hand-to-hand, fighting raged for hours. Some Japanese soldiers penetrated 3 miles behind American lines before being killed. By noon, the charge had collapsed. Over 4,000 Japanese lay dead. General Saito committed ritual suicide that afternoon. So did Admiral Nagumo, the commander who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, who had lost at Midway, now trapped on Saipan. Then came the horror that would haunt American soldiers for the rest of their lives. As Americans advanced into northern Saipan, they encountered the civilian population. Thousands of Japanese families had fled to the island's northernmost cliffs, sheer drops of several hundred feet to rocks and ocean below. Japanese soldiers told civilians the Americans would torture and kill them. Surrender meant dishonor worse than death. Better to die pure than live violated. Families jumped together. Mothers threw their children off the cliffs, then jumped after them. Fathers pushed their families over, then followed. Elderly couples held hands and stepped off together. Some used grenades. Others drowned themselves in the sea below. Americans watched in horror. Marines shouted in English and Japanese, "Don't jump, we won't hurt you." Japanese interpreters used loudspeakers, begging civilians to surrender. "You will be treated well. Your children will be safe." Some believed and surrendered. Most did not. The cliffs became known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. Over 1,000 civilians died there. In caves and jungle hideouts throughout northern Saipan, thousands more killed themselves. Entire families died together. Parents gave their children poison before taking it themselves. Groups committed mass suicide with grenades in caves. The exact number will never be known, but estimates suggest over 10,000 Japanese civilians died on Saipan, most by their own hands. American soldiers tried to stop them. Marines climbed cliffs, trying to reach people before they jumped. Medics waded into the surf, pulling children from the water. Interpreters spent hours talking families out of caves. Some succeeded. Most did not. The psychological impact on American troops was profound. These were not enemy soldiers, but women, children, elderly, innocents, convinced by propaganda that Americans were monsters. Marines who had fought without hesitation in combat broke down watching families die. Corporal Guy Gabaldon, a Mexican-American Marine who spoke Japanese, convinced over 1,000 civilians and soldiers to surrender. He would spend days talking to people, hiding in caves, slowly building trust. His efforts saved hundreds of lives. He was awarded the Silver Star, later upgraded to the Navy Cross. But for every one saved, many more died believing American propaganda about themselves. July 9, 1944. Saipan was declared secure. American casualties: 3,500 killed, 13,000 wounded. Japanese casualties: 32,000 soldiers killed or committed suicide. Civilian casualties: over 10,000 dead. The strategic victory was complete. Within weeks, engineers began constructing massive airfields. By November, B-29 bombers were flying from Saipan to Tokyo. But Saipan had revealed a terrible truth. Japanese propaganda had weaponized the civilian population. Fear of Americans had been so deeply instilled that people chose death over surrender. If this was how civilians behaved on a small island, what would happen on the Japanese home islands with their population of 70 million? The question haunted American planners. An invasion of Japan would not just face fanatical military resistance. It would trigger mass civilian suicides on an unimaginable scale. There had to be another way. But before that decision would come, 2 more islands stood between America and Japan. 2 more battles that would be written in blood. The first was a volcanic rock called Iwo Jima. February 19, 1945. 760 miles south of Tokyo. Iwo Jima, Sulphur Island, was 8 square miles of volcanic ash, sulphur deposits, and black sand. The island rose from the sea in 3 terraces, dominated by a 556-foot extinct volcano called Mount Suribachi at its southern tip. It was one of the ugliest pieces of real estate in the Pacific, and America needed it desperately. By early 1945, B-29 bombers were flying from the Marianas to Japan daily. The round trip was over 3,000 miles. Damaged bombers could not make it back. Crews ditched in the ocean and died. Iwo Jima sat halfway between the Marianas and Japan. Take Iwo, and damaged bombers would have an emergency landing strip. Take Iwo, and P-51 Mustang fighters could escort bombers all the way to Tokyo. The Japanese understood Iwo's value. They sent their best commander to defend it. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was 53 years old, a cavalry officer who had served as military attaché in Canada and the United States in the 1920s. Like Yamamoto, he knew America. He had traveled across the country, visited factories, studied American industry. He knew Japan was losing the war, but he also knew he could make America pay a terrible price. Kuribayashi spent 9 months preparing Iwo's defenses. He rejected the traditional strategy of defending at the beaches and stopping the invasion at the waterline. American firepower made beach defense suicide. Instead, he turned the entire island into a fortress. Over 11 miles of tunnels connected 1,500 bunkers, pillboxes, and caves. Some tunnels descended 5 levels deep. Positions were mutually supporting. Americans attacking one bunker would be fired upon from 3 others. Every gun was in a reinforced position. Artillery pieces were in caves with steel doors. Kuribayashi's orders were simple. Every man must kill 10 Americans before dying. No banzai charges. No wasted lives. Fight from underground. Make them pay for every yard. 21,000 Japanese troops fortified Iwo Jima. They knew they would not survive. They did not expect relief. They would fight until every man was dead. For 3 days before the invasion, American ships and aircraft pounded Iwo. It was the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment of the Pacific War. Battleships fired over 14,000 shells. Bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives. The Marines requested 10 days of bombardment. The Navy said 3 was all they could provide. This disagreement would cost lives. 9 a.m., February 19. The first wave hit the beaches. 30,000 Marines of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions landed on 2,000 yards of black volcanic sand. The beach sloped steeply. Vehicles bogged down in the soft ash. Men struggled to walk. Every step sank ankle-deep in loose volcanic sand. For the first few minutes, there was no resistance. Then the Japanese opened fire. From hidden positions in the terraces above the beach, from caves in Mount Suribachi, from pillboxes that had survived the bombardment, the island erupted in fire. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, and rifles struck the packed beach. Marines had nowhere to hide. The volcanic sand would not hold a foxhole. It collapsed immediately. Men pressed themselves into the ash as shells exploded around them. The beach became a killing ground. But the Marines pushed forward. They advanced yard by yard, using flamethrowers and satchel charges to clear bunkers. Each position had to be destroyed individually. Japanese soldiers would emerge from hidden caves, attack, then disappear underground. By nightfall on the first day, 30,000 Marines were ashore. 551 were dead. Nearly 2,000 were wounded. And the battle had just begun. The Marines' first objective was Mount Suribachi. The extinct volcano dominated the southern end of the island. Japanese observers on its summit could see the entire battlefield and direct artillery fire. For 3 days, Marines fought their way up Suribachi's slopes. Flamethrowers burned defenders from caves. Explosives sealed tunnels. Men climbed over volcanic rock while bullets and grenades came from invisible positions. February 23rd, the 4th day of battle. A 40-man patrol from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines fought to Suribachi's summit. At 10:20 a.m., they raised a small American flag on a piece of pipe. The flag was visible across the island. Ships offshore sounded their horns. Marines on the beach cheered. For a moment, the battle paused. But the flag was small. Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, watching from offshore, wanted a larger flag for posterity. A second patrol went up with a larger flag, 96 by 56 inches. At 12:01 p.m., 6 Marines raised the second flag. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the moment. His photograph would become the most reproduced image in history. 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman struggling to raise the flag on Suribachi's summit while Japanese fire continued. 3 of the 6 would die on Iwo Jima before the battle ended. Harlon Block, killed by artillery. Franklin Sousley, killed by sniper fire. Michael Strank, killed by a shell. The 3 who survived, John Bradley, Rene Gagnon, and Ira Hayes, would tour America selling war bonds. Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian, would struggle with survivor's guilt for the rest of his life. But on February 23rd, The flag meant hope, and the battle was only beginning. For 31 more days, Marines fought across Iwo. Every cave had to be cleared, every tunnel searched, every pillbox destroyed. The fighting was yard by yard, often hand to hand. Flamethrower teams became critical. A flamethrower operator would advance, spray burning fuel into a cave entrance, then retreat while riflemen covered him. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator on Iwo was measured in minutes. March 26, 1945. Iwo Jima was declared secure. But even then, Japanese holdouts remained underground. General Kuribayashi led the final survivors in guerrilla attacks before dying in a final assault. His body was never found. The butcher's bill was staggering. 6,821 Marines killed, 19,217 wounded. Total American casualties, 26,000, nearly 40% of the landing force. Japanese casualties, 18,000 killed out of 21,000 defenders. Only 216 were captured alive, most of them wounded and unconscious. 27 medals of honor were awarded for Iwo Jima, more than any other battle in American history. Was it worth it? By war's end, 2,400 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima. Each bomber carried 11 crewmen. Estimates suggest 27,000 airmen were saved because Iwo existed as an emergency field. The lives saved exceeded the lives lost, but the price was almost unbearable. Iwo Jima became a symbol of American determination, of Japanese fanaticism, of the terrible cost of victory. And one island remained before the Japanese homeland. The bloodiest battle of all was yet to come. April 1st, 1945. Easter Sunday. 183,000 American troops were about to land on the last island before Japan. Okinawa, 350 miles from mainland Japan, was 60 miles long and varied from 2 to 18 miles wide. Nearly 500,000 civilians lived there. Over 110,000 Japanese troops defended it. This would be the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. 1,400 ships supported the invasion. 40 aircraft carriers provided air cover. The operation was code-named Iceberg. It would last 82 days and earn another name, Typhoon of Steel. The landings began at 8:30 a.m. 60,000 troops of the 10th Army, Marines and Army divisions hit the beaches on Okinawa's western coast. They expected the hell of Tarawa, or Iwo Jima. Instead, they found empty beaches. The Japanese had learned beach defenses were useless against American firepower. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima had withdrawn his forces to the island's southern highlands, rugged terrain, honeycombed with caves, perfect for defense. Let the Americans land unopposed. Let them advance. Then bleed them in the hills. By nightfall on April 1st, over 50,000 Americans were ashore without serious resistance. Within days, Marines had captured 2 airfields. The landing seemed almost too easy. Then came the kamikazes. Japan had committed its remaining air forces to Operation Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, waves of suicide attacks against the American fleet. Over 1,900 aircraft would be expended as manned bombs. Most pilots had less than 50 hours of flight training. They needed only enough skill to take off, find the fleet, and dive into a ship. April 6th, 1945. The first mass kamikaze attack. Over 350 aircraft, bombers, fighters, anything that could fly, loaded with explosives and fuel, took off from Kyushu. They headed south toward the American fleet off Okinawa. American radar detected them at 150 miles. Combat air patrol intercepted many before they reached the ships. Anti-aircraft fire destroyed dozens more. But some got through. Kamikazes dove through walls of steel. Some targeted the big carriers, though their armoured flight decks proved resistant. Others struck destroyers and smaller ships on radar picket duty. The destroyer Bush was hit by 3 kamikazes and sank. Destroyer Colquhoun took 4 hits and sank. The battleship Maryland was damaged. Carrier Hancock was hit but remained operational. Over the next 3 months, 1,500 more kamikaze attacks would follow. The psychological impact on American sailors was profound. Conventional attacks could be evaded. But a kamikaze pilot did not care about returning home. He was already dead, a guided missile seeking any target. Gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. They shot down hundreds of kamikazes. But each morning brought new attacks. Each afternoon, more funeral services on crowded decks. By the end of the campaign, kamikazes sank 36 ships and damaged 368 others. Nearly 5,000 American sailors died. More Navy personnel died at Okinawa than at any other battle in American history. But the fleet stayed. They had to. Without naval support, the troops on Okinawa would be isolated and destroyed. On land, the real battle began in mid-April. Marines and Army troops pushed south into the highlands. They encountered the Shuri Line, a defensive network built into ridges and hills anchored by Shuri Castle, an ancient Okinawan fortress. Every hill was a fortress. Every cave held Japanese soldiers. Every ridge had to be taken in brutal close combat. The Japanese strategy was simple: kill as many Americans as possible before dying. Make the cost so high that America would negotiate peace rather than invade the home islands. Rain began in May. For weeks, rain fell constantly. The battlefield became a sea of mud. Vehicles bogged down. Supply lines collapsed. Foxholes filled with water. Men lived in mud, fought in mud, died in mud. Corpses rotted in the mud between the lines. The smell was unbearable. Maggots infested wounds. Disease spread. Men fought in a nightmare landscape of death. But slowly, American firepower prevailed. Flamethrowers burned defenders from caves. Artillery pounded positions day and night. Tanks with mounted flamethrowers, Zippos, incinerated bunkers. Navy guns offshore fired constantly in support. Late May, the Shuri Line collapsed. Japanese forces retreated to the southern tip of Okinawa. There, they would make their final stand. The civilian tragedy unfolded alongside the military battle. 120,000 Okinawan civilians died during the campaign, 1/3 of the island's population. Some died in the crossfire. Others were killed by Japanese troops who viewed them as potential spies or forced them to commit suicide rather than surrender. Many killed themselves, believing American propaganda about American savagery. In caves throughout southern Okinawa, families huddled in darkness, while battles raged outside. When American troops approached, Japanese soldiers often detonated grenades, killing everyone inside. Those who tried to surrender were sometimes shot by their own military. American troops found caves full of dead civilians, children clutching toys, mothers holding infants, entire families dead together. Many Okinawans spoke a dialect distinct from standard Japanese. American interpreters could communicate better with them than with Japanese soldiers. Thousands were persuaded to surrender and were treated well. But Japanese propaganda ran deep. Trust was hard won. Japanese military forced civilians into combat. Children as young as 12 were given grenades and told to attack tanks. Elderly men were armed with bamboo spears. Women served as ammunition carriers under fire. The line between civilian and combatant blurred. Americans, trying to help civilians, sometimes found them armed. Children were used as suicide bombers. The horror of Saipan was being repeated on a vastly larger scale. June 18, 1945. Lieutenant General Simon Buckner, commanding the 10th Army, was observing the front lines when Japanese artillery found his position. A shell fragment tore through his chest. He died 10 minutes later, the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire during the war. June 22, General Ushijima committed ritual suicide. His chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, joined him. They knelt on a ledge overlooking the sea and disemboweled themselves in the samurai tradition. June 23, 1945, is less than #0. 5# is greater than Okinawa was declared secure. The cost was staggering beyond comprehension. American casualties, 12,520 killed in action, 38,000 wounded. Another 26,000 non-battle casualties, mostly from combat fatigue and psychological breakdown. Japanese military casualties, over 110,000 dead, 7,425 captured alive, a record number of Japanese prisoners, suggesting some soldiers were finally willing to surrender. Okinawan civilian casualties, over 120,000 dead. Ships sunk, 36, including 12 destroyers. Ships damaged, 368. Aircraft lost, 763. For 82 days, Okinawa had been hell on earth. And American planners were drawing the obvious, terrifying conclusion. If this was Okinawa, an outer island, what would the invasion of Japan itself cost? The plan for Operation Downfall called for invading Kyushu in November 1945, then Honshu, the main island, in March 1946. 14 combat divisions for Kyushu. 25 divisions for Honshu. Intelligence estimates predicted Japanese forces in the home islands numbered over 2 million troops, but they also estimated that every civilian, men, women and children, would fight. Women were training with bamboo spears. Children were being armed with explosives. The slogan was, 100 million will die for the Emperor. Casualty projections for invading Japan ranged from 500,000 to over 1 million American dead. Japanese casualties, military and civilian, would be in the tens of millions. The lesson of Okinawa was clear. Japan would not surrender. The civilians would not surrender. They would fight until every man, woman, and child was dead. President Harry Truman studied these projections in the summer of 1945. He faced the hardest decision any president had ever confronted. There had to be another way to end the war. And in the New Mexico desert, scientists had just successfully tested that other way. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. Adolf Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. German forces laid down their arms. The war in Europe was over. America could now turn its full attention to Japan. But the man who had led America through most of the war would not see its end. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had died on April 12th at Warm Springs, Georgia. He had served longer than any president in history, 12 years. He had guided America through the Depression and World War II. But the strain had killed him. Vice President Harry Truman became president. Truman had been vice president for only 82 days. Roosevelt had barely consulted him. Truman knew almost nothing about the war's grand strategy. On his first day in office, Secretary of War Henry Stimson briefed him on a secret project. For over 3 years, America had been developing a new weapon of unimaginable power. The Manhattan Project. An atomic bomb. The weapon had not yet been tested. But if it worked, a single bomb could destroy an entire city. Truman inherited a decision that would haunt humanity forever. July 16, 1945. 5:29 a.m. The Trinity test site in the New Mexico desert erupted in light brighter than 1,000 suns. The world's first atomic bomb detonated successfully. The explosion was equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. A mushroom cloud rose 40,000 feet into the sky. The heat was so intense that sand melted into glass. J. Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of the Manhattan Project, watched and recalled a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The weapon worked. Now, the question was whether to use it. July 17, 1945. Potsdam, Germany. Truman met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin to discuss the post-war world. During the conference, Truman received word of Trinity's success. He now possessed a weapon that could end the war without invasion. But the moral implications were staggering. The debate had raged for months within the highest levels of government. Some argued for a demonstration. Detonate the bomb on an uninhabited island with Japanese observers present. Show them the weapon's power and demand surrender. But what if the bomb failed? America had only 2 operational bombs. A failed demonstration would be worse than no demonstration at all. And would Japan surrender after seeing a demonstration? They had not surrendered after Okinawa, after their fleet was destroyed, after their cities were being burned by conventional bombing. Others argued that Japan was already defeated and would soon surrender. The Navy had blockaded the home islands. Conventional bombing was destroying cities. The Soviet Union would declare war. Together, these pressures would force surrender without atomic weapons. But when? How many more Americans would die waiting? Every day the war continued. Hundreds died. 29 crews were shot down. Submarine crews were lost. POWs in Japanese camps died of starvation and disease. The strongest argument for using the bomb was Operation Downfall. The invasion of Japan was scheduled for November. 500,000 to 1 million American casualties were projected. Tens of millions of Japanese would die. If the atomic bomb could end the war without invasion, it would save more lives than it cost. Truman made his decision. On July 26, the Potsdam Declaration was issued. It demanded Japan's unconditional surrender. It promised that refusal would result in prompt and utter destruction. Japan's response came on July 28. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki announced that Japan would mokusatsu the declaration, ignore it with silent contempt. The die was cast. August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. local time. The B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, released its payload over Hiroshima. The bomb, codenamed Little Boy, was a uranium gun-type weapon weighing 9,000 pounds. It fell for 43 seconds. At 1,840 feet above the city, Little Boy detonated. The explosion released the energy equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. A fireball, 180 feet in diameter, appeared instantly. Its surface temperature 11,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the Sunday. Everyone within a mile of ground zero was vaporized instantly. Those further away were burned by thermal radiation. Shadows of people were permanently etched onto walls, all that remained after their bodies were incinerated. The blast wave followed milliseconds later. Buildings collapsed. Wood burst into flame. A city of 350,000 people was destroyed in seconds. Then came the firestorm. Fires ignited throughout the city, merged into a single massive conflagration. Winds of over 100 miles per hour were created by the heat feeding the flames. By nightfall, Hiroshima was gone. 70,000 to 80,000 people died instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll would reach 140,000 as radiation, sickness, and injuries claimed more victims. Truman announced the attack. He called on Japan to surrender immediately or face a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Japan's military leadership did not surrender. Some refused to believe the reports from Hiroshima. Others acknowledged the weapon, but argued Japan must still fight. The military controlled the government. They would not accept surrender. August 8, 1945. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Stalin had promised at Yalta to enter the war 3 months after Germany's defeat. He kept his promise. 1.5 million Soviet troops invaded Manchuria. The Japanese Kwantung Army, once Japan's elite force, was shattered in days. Soviet tanks rolled across Manchuria and into Korea. Japan now faced enemies on all sides. August 9th, 1945, 11:02 a.m. local time. The B-29 Boxcar, with Major Charles Sweeney at the controls, dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The primary target had been Kokura, but clouds obscured the city. Boxcar diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki, a port city and shipbuilding center on Kyushu. Fat Man, a plutonium implosion bomb, detonated over the Urakami Valley. The hills surrounding the valley contained the blast somewhat, reducing damage compared to Hiroshima. Still, 40,000 to 75,000 people died. The city center was obliterated. Nagasaki burned. For 5 days after Nagasaki, Japan's leaders debated. The Supreme War Council was deadlocked. 3 members, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, Prime Minister Suzuki, and Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, favored surrender. 3 members: War Minister Kurachika Anami, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Soemu Toyoda, opposed it. The military faction argued for continuing the war. They claimed Japan could still win a decisive battle on the home islands, inflicting such casualties that America would negotiate favorable terms. But Emperor Hirohito finally intervened. On August 10th, in an unprecedented move, the emperor convened an imperial conference. He listened to arguments from both sides. Then he spoke. The war must end. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration with one condition: the emperor must remain. It was the first time in modern Japanese history that the emperor had made a policy decision. The message was sent to the Allies. America agreed to the condition with the understanding that the emperor would be subject to the supreme commander of Allied powers. On August 14, Hirohito recorded a surrender message to be broadcast the next day. That night, army officers attempted a coup to prevent the broadcast. They failed. Some committed suicide rather than accept surrender. August 15, 1945. Noon, Tokyo time. For the first time in history, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice. Hirohito's recorded message announced Japan's surrender. He spoke in formal court language few could understand. But the meaning was clear. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Japan had surrendered. The decision to use atomic weapons remains controversial. Did the bombs end the war? Or would Japan have surrendered anyway? Was it necessary to use both bombs? Were the targets justified? These questions have no simple answers. What is certain? The atomic bombs killed over 200,000 people. Most were civilians. Survivors suffered radiation sickness, cancer, and other effects for decades. But Operation Downfall did not occur. The invasion that would have cost millions of lives was cancelled. The war ended. On September 2nd, 1945, representatives of the Empire of Japan would formally surrender aboard an American battleship in Tokyo Bay. The bloodiest war in human history was about to end. September 2nd, 1945. 9:04 a.m. Tokyo Bay. The battleship USS Missouri sat at anchor, surrounded by hundreds of Allied warships. On her deck, beneath guns that had bombarded Japanese cities, a surrender table was placed. General Douglas MacArthur stood at the microphone. Behind him, representatives from the United States, China, Britain, Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, Netherlands, and New Zealand is less than Hashone. 0 hash is greater than. The Japanese delegation arrived. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu walked with a cane. He had lost his leg in a bombing years earlier. General Yoshijiro Umezu, representing the military, stood rigid with humiliation. MacArthur spoke. It is my earnest hope, indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. Shigemitsu signed the surrender document at 9:04. His hand trembled. Umezu signed at 9:06, his face a mask of stone. MacArthur signed for the Allies at 9:08. 3 years, 8 months, and 25 days after Pearl Harbor, the war was over. The cost was almost incomprehensible. American military deaths in the Pacific, 111,606. Wounded, over 253,000. Japanese military deaths, approximately 2.1 million. Civilian deaths, estimates range from 500,000 to 1 million, including those killed by atomic bombs and conventional bombing. Chinese casualties, an estimated 20 million, most during Japan's occupation and war crimes. Across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, millions more died: Filipino, Indonesian, Burmese, Malayan, and countless others caught in the war's fury. The questions remain. Could the war have been avoided? Could it have ended sooner? Was the atomic bomb necessary? Could Japan have been defeated without it? Is less than Hashone, zero hash, is greater than? History offers no certain answers, only reflections. The Pacific War transformed the world. It ended empires. Britain, France, Netherlands lost their Asian colonies. Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere collapsed, but it sparked independence movements across Asia. It created a new superpower. America emerged from the war as the world's dominant military and economic force. The arsenal of democracy became the guarantor of global security. It revolutionized warfare. Aircraft carriers replaced battleships. Air power became decisive. And atomic weapons changed everything. War between great powers became potentially suicidal. It forged alliances that endure today. Former enemies became allies. Within a decade, Japan and America were partners. The reconciliation was remarkable, though scars remained on both sides. From Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, the Pacific War was a crucible that forged the modern world. It was fought across 10,000 miles of ocean, on hundreds of islands, by millions of men. Some battles lasted 5 minutes. Others lasted 6 months. But every battle, from the humiliation at Savo Island to the triumph at Leyte Gulf, from the hell of Tarawa to the nightmare of Okinawa, was paid for in blood. On the deck of the Missouri, MacArthur concluded the ceremony. Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. As the Japanese delegation departed, Allied aircraft, 400 B-29s and 1,500 Navy fighters, flew over Tokyo Bay in victory formation. The roar of engines filled the sky. The same engines that had brought destruction now heralded peace. The Second World War was over. The Pacific was quiet, and the world would never be the same.